Start by saying thank you to Don for tackling the long reading right there. Just disappointed that Jimmy wasn't here, to be honest with you. I like to assign the longest readings possible to Jimmy, and when Jimmy wasn't here, it just wasn't the same. But Don, you handled it well in Jimmy's absence right there. But when I was getting it ready, I thought, well, I was trying to find a scripture reading, and I thought, well, this is about the best one, but it was hard to find a verse or two out of that. So I thought, well, let Don tackle the whole thing. So it worked out well. So I appreciate that. And our songs tonight sort of fit right along with what we're going to be talking about. Last week we talked about the resurrection of Jesus. Um, we talked about how that Peter and John, they had went to the tomb, Mary Magdalene and others. We didn't really talk about appearances, at least in the specific sense. Tonight we're going to talk about what I think will be the first four appearances that Jesus makes out of 10. Now, that is not to imply that that's how many people saw Jesus. But think about it this way. If you had four different tasks that you had to do, if you had to go pay the water bill, and then you had to go to the grocery store, well, there's probably one employee at the water place that would see you, but 20 people at the grocery store that would see you. Think about it that way. So in some of these situations where Jesus, these appearances, sometimes there will be a larger crowd, sometimes maybe a smaller crowd. So when I use the word first appearance, second appearance, or so on, don't think that that's just one singular person that we're talking about. We're going to talk a little bit about each of these, and we've got a few scriptures that we're going to look at here along the way as well. But the first appearance, Mary Magdalene discovers the empty tomb and tells Peter and John. And later, she will return to the tomb weeping. We had talked about last week how that the women were there first. They'd all kind of went roughly together. How did Peter and John respond when they were told of the tomb being empty? Do you remember from last week? They took off running. They run toward it. And yeah. So, yeah. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this as we go, but we'll be talking most specifically about Mary Magdalene to start. And she looks in the tomb and she sees two angels who speaks to her. And then she'll turn away, and Jesus himself was there and would speak as well. And we'll see how that she first thought that this was, the Bible uses the word gardener. I don't know what the exact right term is, but somebody who worked there is fitting for a term for somebody right there. But then she recognizes who it was. And that will be the first appearance after Jesus's resurrection. So we're going to start with Mark 16, verses 9 through 11, and then I think we'll jump over into John chapter 20. So we're going to hit Mark 16 and then go into John, and then we'll actually come back to Mark after that. Ben, do you care to read these verses here? Mark 16, verses 9 through 11.
Now, when he arose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 demons. She went and told those that had been with him, as they mourned and wept. And when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they did not believe.
So there's a couple things I want you to look at. We'll deal with questions in a second, but two major things that I want you to see right here. It says he appears first to Mary Magdalene, and then it gives this sort of qualifier to her as well, out of whom he had cast 7 demons. I want you to keep that in mind as we go a little bit further this evening, okay? So that descriptor perhaps about her. The second thing I want you to look at is the last sentence, that they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her. This part right here, they did not believe. And so keep those two in mind, and we'll go a little further with it in just a second. This is John chapter 20, 11 through 18. Dad, do you care to read this? I think it's 3 slides too.
Jesus opened up his heart and said, "Son, if you carry me away, come into your place, and I will take you away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him, "Rabboni," which says teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. Go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene came and told the disciples that she had seen the Lord, and that he had spoken these things to her.
All right. So we're going to work from both Mark 16 and John chapter 20, considering this. And some of these questions are fact based, and some of these I want you to think about and maybe apply your thoughts on it as first. But let's go to Mark 16 and verse 9 here to start with. When and to whom does Jesus appear first? Let's do the when part first. When does it say? So he rose early on the first day of the week. And we talk about meeting together on Sundays, and we talk about Easter Sunday holidays being the day that Jesus was risen. The first day of the week. We read here early on the first day. And he appears first to who? Mary Magdalene. All right. And so amongst other people that were in and around when Jesus was crucified, and then when they went to try and hopefully be able to prepare the body, she would have been one of those. After she tells Peter and John about the empty tomb, she then returns to it. And as she stood weeping, she looks into the tomb. This is John chapter 20, what Dad read a second ago. She looks into the tomb and sees what? Now, before you answer that, what do you anticipate seeing when you go to a tomb? A body. Okay, I don't know what that exactly would have looked like at the time, but we talked about it being wrapped up, right? And why were they going to the tomb? There you go. In a sense, the way that we consider embalming today, which happens before the funeral, in this case, it was sort of happening post execution. And so it would have certainly been a traumatic experience going to this tomb and seeing a friend laying there dead. But that's not what she sees. What does she see when she looks into the tomb? Two angels, right? So I want you to consider that for just a second. You've been troubled by the death of a friend. The Sabbath has sort of interrupted your life. You know, had Jesus been crucified on a Wednesday afternoon, when would they have taken care of his body? When would Mary Magdalene, for instance, when would she have? Probably Thursday, probably right then. But that Sabbath kept it from being able to do so. And then you go to this tomb and you see two angels. Maybe what comes into your mind then? I know it's a hard question to answer, but sure. It's probably a good word. Frightening. Sure. Uh-huh. Right. Others? Again, those are sort of opinion questions. It's hard to put ourselves into that place. Most of us have never been in a place that would even be close to that. And so the angels then ask her why she was weeping. And so they ask her, why was she weeping? How did she respond to the question? This is John chapter 20 and verse 13. She says, "They have taken away my Lord." And then even more than that, that's a comment. They've taken away my Lord, and then what? So that's a double problem, right? And the fact that who she was coming to fix the body for has been taken away is problematic. But then not only that, I don't know where that person was buried. Will and I, a couple weeks ago, was up at the Hopkins family cemetery, and I was telling him how that the first person, the oldest the person who died the first there was not actually buried there. He was buried in a different place. And then they buried someone else there, and then they brought that body over. It's 2 years later, I think it was 1919. And Will and I were just kind of sitting there like, that would have been something else, you know. And I know Dad, or the stories have come down that the people who moved that body from one hill over to another wasn't a real enjoyable experience, I think, for them. And so whenever she goes to this tomb and she sees not only is he not there, that's a problem, but then her second problem is what? Where have they taken him? Where would I need to go to find him? Josh. Right. Yeah, but that's not something that happens too often. You're exactly right. Dad, go ahead. Sure. 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 Absolutely. So after speaking, she turns and sees Jesus. Now, I say that exactly the way the Bible describes it. She turns and sees someone, right? That's how she sort of interpreted it. Who did she presume to actually see right there? The gardener, somebody that's working there, someone whose job is to be there. And so I ask this question not because you're going to know the answer, but why do you think she doesn't recognize Jesus in this spot? And there are no right or wrong answers to this question. This is why do you think, Maria? Right. I think that's probably the first place that my mind goes is that he's dead. So of all the people you expected to see alive, that's probably the last one. Why else, perhaps? Maybe so. Right. Cloaked himself a little bit, maybe. Ben, go ahead.
I think too, the Mark mostly do with the mind. Like when he was walking on the water to them, and then see that it's a ghost.
Right.
And obviously it was Jesus, but your mind says that's not a human
That's
being.
not real. Right.
That's the same way it can't be Jesus because somebody looks like him.
Sure. Sure.
I think the lighting would have been terrible. They would not have had a flashlight or anything like we would have had. It would just been maybe paint or glue.
Sure. Well, the first question I asked too was she's crying, right? And you know, imagine crying as hard as you can, and then but also trying to drive down the road. That's probably not a safe. You know, you're probably not recognizing the other cars and the stop signs the way that you would in that situation. And so I pose that question to you just because we sometimes think, well, I would recognize this anywhere. You know, we give ourselves credit for stuff that maybe we couldn't do. And the same thing perhaps happens there with her. When Jesus speaks her name, how then did she respond in verse 16? Right. Rabboni or teacher. And I'm intrigued by that she doesn't call him by name. She calls him teacher, whatever, you know, the Hebrew, the Aramaic, the language is different. But Rabboni or teacher, I think that says a lot about the relationship between the two. How did she view him?
Well, part of it too is culture. Women, especially, refer to them. You didn't call them by the first name.
Right.
You spoke to them with the reverence of the title.
Right. I will say this, though you'll laugh about this because you always do. There's about 7 people that are coworkers of mine that I had as students. And some of them who are married and have children will still call me Mr. Hopkins. And it's like, okay, we don't have to be that formal right there. But sometimes those names get sort of stuck in us. And a lot of you could see your first grade teacher in Walmart tonight, and you'd still call her Miss So-and-so. And you can see maybe a little bit of that. There's that reverence, there's that respect forward. I think one more question right here. Her actions following the recognition of Jesus was what? There's three parts here. Let's look at the first part of the question. John chapter 20 and verse 17. How does she toward Jesus? I know she speaks his name, or at least says Rabboni, our teacher. How did she react or act toward him, I guess? Verse 17. Well, I think that's what we see right there. The Bible uses the word cling to him right there. Now, did Jesus want that response from her? No, we see that he didn't. And he gives an explanation for it. Is that what? He's not what? He's not yet ascended, which is an interesting thought comment, but I want to go on to the last question. He actually makes two requests of Mary Magdalene in verse 17. So let's go into verse 17 real quick and look at the two requests that are posed to him. He says, do not cling to me, for I've not yet ascended to my Father. That's the first thing. It's not really a request. That's just him saying, this is not the time. What's the first thing that he asked then of her? Go to my brethren and tell them what? I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my God and to your God. And so he asked her to do this task for him. Okay? Now keep that in mind, along with what we just read in Mark chapter 16 as well. When Mary Magdalene goes to the disciples, what were they doing? This is Mark 16. You may have to go back verses 10 and 11. So Mark 16, verses 10 and 11. She does what she's asked to do. She goes to the disciples here, the apostles. What were they doing when she goes to them? They were mourning and weeping. Why? The same traumatic experience that she's just went through, they've just went through as well, right? And some of them, we talked about Peter and John, but all of these people have experienced, a really difficult situation. So she goes back and tells them of her experience. Did they believe her report? That's interesting, right? It's interesting that they did not believe what she said. So I pose to you this question. Why do you think they didn't believe what she said? Because the way that she responds to him leads us to believe that they were a fairly close connection. They were friendly. I would imagine that the apostles who've spent 3 years with Jesus probably at least know who she's not a stranger. So why do you think they didn't believe what she had said? Josh, are you?
I think it's interesting. I don't know why. She spoke two languages. And if I'm not mistaken, most people that's encountered angels in the Bible, when the angels speak, they believe it. Being prophets or messengers of God. It made me that she still didn't believe until she actually turned to see Jesus. And then she comes back to tell them, I've seen two angels, they told me this, and then see Jesus. So you have critical references saying, hey, this is one why I didn't believe it.
I don't know. Others,
And that makes me
sure. Other people want to throw out an idea. Why do you think they didn't believe? Right. Right. You're going to be no, then yes, instead of yes, then no. Mary? Sure. So I want us to think about Mark 16 and verse 9. In my time sort of prepping for this is something that I sort of thought about. In Mark chapter 16 in verse 9, it says, now when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had demons. We talked about when we did our miracle study about it was a somewhat common thing that Jesus did. So casting out demons would not have been uncommon for the apostles who would have been there. But I wonder, just by sort of reading all of this, I wonder if there was sort of a stigma that went along with demon possession. I'm posing this, and I'm just not basing this on anything in particular. But if the person who had demons cast out, and it says she had 7 demons cast out, if there was still this sort of way of thinking that said, that person's kind of crazy. Does that make sense? I'm not proposing that that's true, false, anything. But I wonder if, because of this fact that this is included about her as something that happened to her, if they might have looked at her a little different than somebody who maybe didn't. I have no idea if that's true. I'm not trying, please do not go out and say that it is. But when I'm thinking about why they wouldn't have believed her, that's one thing that sort of popped into my head as well. Thoughts on it, Don?
The idea of what Jesus did coming in the cross and dying on the cross, I mean, would that not have been just blow our mind?
Sure.
Necessarily. And so he went on, and the idea of resurrection, because here in verse 12 and 13, it says, see, he changed form, the 2 of them. Told them, and they didn't believe either.
Sure.
So I'm just saying there's a whole succession of
Right.
things that Jesus is doing by his power and everything that it's just hard for people to believe.
I think we talked last week too about how the accusation was made. They said he'd tear this temple down and build it back in 3 days. And I revert back to that because I don't know how many of the apostles didn't kind of believe that same thing as well, that they maybe weren't thinking about that building, and you're not thinking about who it's going to be. Ben, go ahead.
I think too that we're going back to what you said, who loves more, the one that was forgiven the most.
Right.
Now I think other than Jesus' mother, there's probably no one that wanted it to be truer than Mary Magdalene that Jesus wasn't there.
Right.
And I think that they thought she was just hysterical, distraught, but I'd say she was just, they knew that she wanted it more than anything else.
Let's go to the second appearance. I don't think we can get a definitive answer on that. I just wanted to pose that. Josh, before we go on.
How many of those people that witnessed Jesus there witnessed the resurrection of Lazarus?
I'm gonna have to ask for a book, chapter, and verse for Ben on that one. I'm not sure if that's.
They know about Jesus, they've seen him raised the dead, they've heard of it, and they've seen Lazarus, they watched it. Why would it be so hard? I don't know. I just think about these things that just don't make sense. They can see the power of Jesus. They know he's the Son of God, so why would it be hard to believe that he did raise from the dead?
Mary first, then Boo.
Amen.
Right. Was that what you were going to say? Yeah. Right. Yeah. Sure. Sure. In the second appearance, as the other women who had visited the tomb, we talked about this last week, there were women, plural, visited the tomb in the early morning. They returned to the city to tell the disciples about the empty tomb. Jesus had met them along the way. This is Jesus' second appearance after his resurrection. And we're going to read about that right here. This is Matthew 28, just simply verses 9 and 10. Josh, you want to read those?
Jesus said to them, do not be afraid. Go and tell my brethren to go to Galilee, and there they will see me.
Okay. And so a little bit about this. Jesus appears to the women. This is not Mary Magdalene, but these are the other women here, as they go to tell his disciples about the empty tomb. Obviously makes sense that they're going to go, when they realize the tomb was empty, they're going to go tell somebody about it. Somebody needs to know about this. How do they respond? And let's be specific here. Matthew chapter 28, in verse 9, So take your answer out of that verse only. How do they respond to him? So they come to him. So there's this physical movement toward him. It says they held him by the feet. So that tells us that Jesus's body was what? Human, or what is close to human. Is if you can grab somebody by the feet, that's a thing. And then they did what? They worshiped him. And so they clearly recognize who he is. They clearly worshiped him in their belief of who he was. And so they're continuing to treat him that way as well. So I posed the question to you then, and we've already talked about it a little bit, but I like to do this. So I apologize if it bothers you. But how do you think you would have responded to this situation if it was the women and then you there as well? Leery, perhaps so, shocked, right? Yeah, it's interesting, right? It is quite interesting. It feels like there's some sort of moving away from the tomb that had to be sort of had to happen right there. Jesus tells them in verse 10 to tell the brethren, the apostles, the disciples, his contingent. He says to tell them two things, okay? It's a what not to do and a what to do kind of a thing. We talked a little bit about this morning. This is not exactly that. But first of all, in verse 10, what does he tell them not to do? He said, do not be afraid, okay? So there's no reason to be scared or nervous. This would have been comforting because, Don, you used the word leery just a minute ago. I would imagine fear would have been, there's been a sense of that in the comments that you all have made. But he says, don't be afraid. Well, I don't know if that would have worked, him telling them that, but at least he's saying don't be afraid. But then he says it's not just a matter of don't be afraid. He gives them a second task as well. What's that? There, absolutely. So this is an important task given to them. Now, this is an important job. They are to go to the brethren, whoever might be in that group, but is telling them they have an important role to go and fulfill, right? And so they're not just sort of stragglers, but Jesus gives them a task here. So I ask, what was the reasoning for these detailed instructions? This is not a high five, hey, good to see you, but there's don't do this and do this. Why? What was the reasoning for these detailed instructions? Right? Sure. Others? And so he gives these sort of, like I said, detailed instructions, but they would play a vital role in what was going to take place. Go ahead, sir.
One of your questions back to you. What do you think of the significance of the women? Isn't it interesting? Who's beginning to, who's doing all of this work to get to the men? I know there's
sure.
I just always find that very interesting. How that took place.
I think it's very interesting, and I'm going to speak 2-ish years in the church. Jesus spoke to the women who readily believe with the men who have to be twisted and turned and all that. You can almost go into any conversation anywhere, and there'll be more of what group than the other. There'll be more of women than the men. I don't know why that's the case, but even it almost seems like even from the beginning, the women were more accepting, perhaps more willing to accept, and there were a lot of doubting Thomases that were there, not just one. Sure, probably so. Well, And I think it's probably a cultural thing too. It probably that was a job that women did more than men, and not fulfilling that job would have certainly been a negative. We need to go on because we've got a few other things to look at. This is Luke 24, verses 9 through 11. Will, do you care to read this, please? We'll come back to that here in just a second. So when the women tell the 11 apostles and the others what Jesus had requested of them, again, I asked that question a minute ago. They had a job they had to go do, and did they do it? The women absolutely did. How did the apostles respond? And I'll take the actual scriptural answer right here at 24, verse 9 through 11. They didn't believe. I want to look at verse 11. Let's take the new. I don't know what the old King James. Lucille, you can correct me if it's wrong. But chapter 24 and verse 11, the New King James Version says, "And their words, the women, their words seemed to them, the men, like quote idle tales, and they didn't believe them." Is that what the old King James? Yeah, and every now and then the old King James gets it right, I guess. So seemed like idle tales right there. But I think that speaks to sort of the way they viewed these. There's something about the word idle tales right there in the way we would say it is, you're just making that up, right? That we can hear that exact same thing right there. So I actually kind of already, go ahead. Maybe so. Yours does? Oh, yes. Idle talk, hearsay, gossip, nonsense. Y'all's all sitting around chatting, getting the bottom. They probably wouldn't have been the first people that sat around and talked while they prepared a bottom. They are. They're all negative. So I kind of already asked this question, but I want us to, if we got anything more to say about it, do you think the responses of disciples to both Mary Magdalene and to the other women? So this is not like they were all together. These are two sort of completely different situations. Do you think that sheds light onto the place of women at the time? Again, we kind of already asked that question, but yes, no, maybe. And then why? Mm-hmm. Right. Sure. 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 Sure.
That was my point earlier. I think what you said is right, but also I believe there was an importance of the women and their role there. There might have been characteristics of these, but I think they had a very important role that he shows them.
I think so as well. Just toss this up there. This is what I mentioned a second ago in the question, but in Luke chapter 8 and verse 2, we also read that he cast out the 7 demons for Mary Magdalene. And so perhaps maybe that's what influenced their sort of opinions. I think there's a cultural influence that's here as well. The job of the women was to go dress the body, so to speak. That go do that. Don't come back here telling us about this and that, which had happened. And so I think looking at this in a cultural sense is like valid for us as well.
Impossibility of the whole thing.
Sure.
Like we were saying earlier, if you sit there and see them piercing side, there ain't nobody coming back from that, especially because Jesus was the one that was bringing all these people back before. They killed him. It's just not possible.
Certainly would have been a lot more believable if they'd come back and said, he's laying there dead. I mean, that would have been a lot more believable than the other side had that been. If they'd come back and did that, they wouldn't have said, there would have been nothing to say. Meanwhile, some of the guards who'd been at the tomb go into the city and they tell the chief priest what had happened at the tomb, the earthquake, which we talked about a couple weeks ago, the appearance of the angel who rolled back the stone. So this is the story on the other side. And this is an issue as well. So I'm going to talk about this briefly as we sort of wrap things up here just a bit. Matthew 28, this is verses 11 through 15. Kevin, do you care to read this, sir?
Now, while they were going, behold, some of the guards came into the city and reported to the chief priests all things that had happened. And when they had assembled with the elders and the soldiers together, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers, saying, tell them his disciples came at night and stole him away while we slept. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will appease him and make you secure. So they took the money and did as they were instructed. And this saying is commonly reported among the Jews until this time.
This is not a question that I have posed up here, but we talked about this last week. Who had requested a guard? The Jewish leaders. It was not Pilate. Pilate didn't, he wasn't really, he was kind of, the show was over for him, but he said, you've requested a guard. Here's your guard. Go ahead and take it. And so they come back and they say, look, we were supposed to guard them and now they're not. And this could be a big problem for the guards. And so how does the assembled council handle this report from the guards? They threw a little money at them, right? They threw a little bit of money at them, large sum of money, the Bible, I guess, says.
The governor found out they abandoned their post or that this would happen, they'd have been executed.
Absolutely.
We'll keep you alive too.
And then that kind of goes into the second question. They instructed the soldiers to say what if anybody had asked? And that was the fear. And then they came and they said, go ahead and just say that. Would there have been concern amongst the guards about saying this? What's your job as a guard? To guard, right? To guard. A Roman soldier who slept while on guard duty received the death penalty here, right? And so if this story reaches the ears of the Roman governor, the Jewish leaders would have had to persuade him to overlook the offense. And so it's essentially kind of, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. You just tell them that it was stolen. That's fine. We will take care. If they come down, we'll step in and say, yeah, we were worried about this and it happened. Don't blame these guys. This is just sort of what happened. So it's important to note that there's stuff happening on the Jesus side, but there's also some stuff happening on the government side here as well. Third appearance. We can read this in Luke 24 and verse 34, also in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 5. The first one, Luke 24 and 34, partially saying the Lord is risen indeed and has appeared to Simon. Paul writes to the Corinthians in 15 and verse 5 that he was seen by Cephas, Peter, and then by the 12. According to Luke and Paul, we see this the third time. We don't see this told in every other gospel. Only Luke mentions this sort of third appearance, and then of course Paul writes about it a little bit later as well. As you can imagine, the last thing here would have created great excitement there. Let's finish it up with the fourth appearance. This is what Don read to us a while back, and so I want to finish that right here. We read that later in the afternoon on the first day of the week, Jesus joins two disciples as they're walking in the country on the way to Emmaus. I've tried really hard to find a picture of the road to Emmaus. I don't believe this is a picture of the road to Emmaus, but there are trails you can walk in Israel, and there's sort of a Holy Land Trail, I think is the title, and it takes you to various places. But I think this fits as a pretty apt look of what a road from point A to point B would have looked like. And whether or not this is the road to Emmaus doesn't really matter. You can imagine a couple people strolling along this road talking about what had took place. Emmaus is, I think Don read it, 7 miles from Jerusalem. So it's not here to Lancaster. It's not too far on the way. It only mentions the name of one, Cleopas, and nothing more is known of these people. But they're discussing the events of the past few days, and they're unaware of the identity of Jesus. And that's where, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about it, but that's where what we had read about a moment ago. Boom. Probably so. Right. Could be. So let's go back to this real quick as we finish, because I've sort of purposefully asked a couple questions tonight, which was, how do you think you would have reacted? How would you have responded? What would you have said in this situation? And what we see in this story from Luke chapter 24 is probably how you would have reacted. If you read Luke 24, verse 13 through 35, the story of these two men walking on the road to Emmaus, Cleopas and his friend, you can probably fill those names. You can mark out the names and put your name and your friend's name, because they were having the same conversation that you probably would have had as well. Now imagine you've spent some time in Jerusalem. I'm sure they were there for Passover. I'm sure Emmaus is probably either where they lived or where they were going to. You mentioned Warm Spring there as well. What were they talking about on this trip? The events of the day, the news, right? You know, there's a lot that had happened. And so what happens as they're making this trip? It goes from two people. Jesus joins them. I love the question that the guy asked when Jesus says, what's happening? And he says, you must be the only person in Jerusalem who doesn't know this, right? But he says that for what reason? Everybody knew what had took place right here. But do they know it's Jesus? But they clearly befriend him. It said there that Jesus started to him with Moses, right? And told him about everything. That reminds me of Philip whenever he stops, or when he sidles up beside the Ethiopian eunuch on the way out of Jerusalem as well. But he starts there and he tells them all of this stuff, right? Right. Sure. Right. News traveled slower, of course, then, but I'm sure there was probably some of them. It's going to be hard to explain this when we get home as well. And so they invite Jesus into their home, right? They ask him, or they stop and they say, come in and do what? Come and eat with us. And did they ever figure out who Jesus was? As soon as they begin to eat, they do. And then what happens to Jesus? He's gone. He just like that. And certainly a story to have been told. But like I said, I asked those questions earlier because I think the story of the road to Emmaus really is a good description of probably how we would have responded. How many of you have ever thought, if I had just thought of that, I'd have said it? But then it's too late. Or the funniest retort you've ever come up with was in the car 20 minutes after you had a chance to say it. If I'd have said that, they'd all been laughing, that kind of thing. Well, the same thing sort of happens with these men. It's like they realize this is Jesus, but it's too late. And I'm sure they probably thought we could have probably done a little bit more, said a little bit more, learned a little bit more along the way. I do think it's interesting, though, that Jesus teaching them right there from the beginning. But is there ever really a time in Scripture that Jesus isn't teaching? Really, and it's not always by word, it's sometimes by deed. And I think the same lesson can apply for us as well. Questions before we call it a night?
I don't think it's so much different than today in a sense. I've always thought about the Red Sea part. I believe it with all my heart, but you have to admit that's an unusual act. And even if I'd have been there,
Right.
So it's just so much of this is spiritual in a physical form happening that I just think it's hard to comprehend. And today we teach people, we'll hear all kinds of weird stuff.
Sure.
Responses.
Sure.
Today.
Other thoughts or comments, questions? 4 appearances, so there are 6 more or more weeks when it's all said and done to cover. But I appreciate everyone's participation. Yeah, never know that answer. We'll never know that answer. Anyone else? Gracias.